What would you do if you came home to find your wife throwing your life over a fourth-floor balcony rail, your clothes and your books and the tools your grandfather left you raining down onto the sidewalk, while the whole street watched, and you did not shout or beg or say a single word, and drove away and never came back? She watched him do it from the balcony. That was the part he thought about afterward. Not the shouting that had come before it, and not the neighbors in their windows, but the fact that she stood up there with her arms folded and watched a man kneel on a public sidewalk and gather his own belongings out of the gutter, and that at no point in the 11 minutes it took him did it occur to her to come down. That was the last time she ever saw him do it. This is a story of hidden worth, of a man who had absorbed contempt for so long he had forgotten it was not weather, and of the quiet, devastating dignity of walking away without one word of argument. Martin Vogel had spent 38 years being the person who cleaned up. He was soft-spoken and unhurried, with careful hands and a stillness that people routinely mistook for having nothing to say, and he had been married for 11 years to a woman named Camille, who had, somewhere in the middle of them, stopped seeing him entirely. It had not happened in one blow. That was what he would try to explain later, badly, to the only person who ever asked. It had happened in 1,000 small subtractions, an eye roll at a dinner party, a story about him told to friends in a tone that invited them to laugh, a habit of answering questions that had been put to him. He had absorbed all of it patiently, the way he absorbed everything, and had told himself, for years, that this was what a marriage was, that a man who does not fight is a man who keeps the peace. And he had grown so used to being small in that apartment that he had stopped noticing the size of the space he was allowed. What none of the people who had watched Camille roll her eyes at him for a decade ever bothered to learn was what Martin actually did with his hands. Because Martin Vogel was a luthier, not a hobbyist. His grandfather had been a violin maker in a small European city and had come out of a very bad century with almost nothing but a roll of tools, and he had put them into Martin's hands when the boy was 11 and taught him a craft that almost nobody alive still practices properly. Martin could take a 200-year-old instrument that had been dropped, cracked, badly repaired by 3 previous hands, and bring it back so completely that the repair could not be found by a man with a light and a magnifier. He understood wood, the way other people understand weather. He could hold an unlabeled violin, tap the plate twice, look at the grain and the corner blocks and the way a maker had cut a scroll, and tell you the workshop it came from and roughly the decade. And he was right, consistently, in a field where being right is rare and expensive. He did this in the back room of a shop on the north side of the city, for a salary for a man named Roland Pike, and he had never once complained that the work went out under Roland's name because the work going out was the part he cared about. And on the afternoon, everything changed. He came home early with a broken plane blade in his pocket and found the balcony door open and his life going over the rail. It had started, as these things do, over nothing. A comment about money. A remark about the hours he kept in the workshop, which had become, over 11 years, the thing Camille reached for when she wanted to draw blood, because she had learned it was the only place he was truly alive, and therefore the only place that could still hurt him. He had said, mildly, that the work mattered to him. And Camille Vogel had looked at him with an expression he had seen 1,000 times and would never see again, and had said, "It is not work, Martin. It is a hobby that a grown man does in a shed for another man's profit." And then she had walked to the balcony with his canvas tool roll in her hand and dropped it over the rail. Then she went back for more. His clothes came down. Like birds, his books, the box of correspondence from his grandfather, in a language Camille had never bothered to learn. and Martin Vogel stood in the middle of the living room and did not move, and something in him that had been bending for 11 years simply, quietly finished. He did not shout. He did not grab her arm. He walked out of the apartment and down 4 flights and out onto the sidewalk where a crowd of neighbors had gathered, and he knelt down in front of all of them and began to pick up his belongings one at a time without hurrying, in the total silence of a man doing something final. He found the tool roll first. 3 of his grandfather's gouges had come out of it, and one was chipped, and he wrapped them and set them in the car. He gathered the books. He collected the letters that had blown into the gutter and dried them against his shirt. It took 11 minutes. Camille stood on the balcony the entire time, with her arms folded, waiting, he understood later, for the part where he came back upstairs. He did not come back upstairs. He got into his car with everything he owned in the passenger seat and drove away, and he did not slam the door, and he did not look up at the balcony, and he never set foot in that apartment again. He did not tell anyone. That was the thing that would confound Camille most in the months afterward, that there was no scene, no lawyer's letter for weeks, no furious phone call, no mutual friend appearing with a message. He simply stopped being there. He slept in the back room of the workshop for 9 days on a camp bed among the shavings and the smell of hide glue and spirit varnish, and every single morning he woke at 5 and worked. The first night was the worst of his life. He lay in the dark, listening to the building tick and cool, and waited for the grief to arrive. And what came instead, sometime after 3, was something he had no name for and did not trust, which was relief, vast and shameful and total. He did not sleep at all that night. He got up at 4 and started work on a cracked cello top and did not stop until the light came in, and something strange began to happen over those 9 days, which was that the shaking in his hands stopped. He had assumed for years that the tremor was age or coffee. It was not. It went away entirely inside 2 weeks, and Martin Vogel sat with that fact one evening with a cup of tea going cold beside him and understood, with a clarity that made his chest hurt, exactly what he had been living inside of. He rented a room, one room, with a window that faced a wall, and he was happier in it than he had been in 11 years in an apartment with a balcony. He kept working. He told no one where he was. 2 people from the old life wrote to him in that first month, and both letters were essentially the same letter, which was that Camille was very upset and that he had handled things badly, and Martin read them both and understood something that would take him another year to say out loud, which was that in 11 years not one person had ever written to ask whether he was all right. And in the 5th week, a woman walked into the shop who would change the entire direction of his life. Ada Lohman was the reason rooms had temperatures. She was 68 tall, severe, and dressed in black, and she was the most feared appraiser of stringed instruments in the country, a woman who could kill a 6-figure sale with a raised eyebrow and had done so more than once. Dealers were terrified of her. She had a reputation for cruelty that was not entirely deserved and entirely useful, and what she actually was, underneath it, was a person with almost no patience left for fraud, and none at all for flattery. She came into Roland Pike's shop that afternoon, carrying a case, because a client of hers had bought an instrument there 8 months earlier, and something about it had been quietly bothering her ever since. Roland met her at the door and talked for 11 minutes about provenance. Ada Lohman listened with the expression of a woman waiting for a bus. Then she opened the case and put the violin on the counter and said she wanted the person who had done the restoration. Roland said smoothly that he had done it himself. And Ada Lohman said, "No, you did not, and the temperature in that shop dropped 20 degrees. She turned it over. "The retouch on the lower bout," she said. "The graft at the neck. Whoever did that work has hands, I have seen perhaps 4 times in 40 years, and you are not that person, Mr. Pike, because I have watched you handle an instrument, and you do it like a man carrying a suitcase." She looked up. "Bring me whoever is in your back room." And that was how Martin Vogel, in a stained apron with glue on his fingers, came out into the front of the shop for the first time in 6 years and met the only person in that city who had ever looked at his work and seen him. She asked him 3 questions: where he had learned, and he told her about a man who had come out of a very bad century with a roll of tools. What he had used for the retouch, and he told her, and she raised her eyebrows slightly, because it was not what anyone would have guessed, and it was better. And then the third, which was why, if he could do that, his name was on nothing. Martin answered the first 2 easily. The third took him a moment, and when he answered it, he did it honestly, because he had run out of the energy for anything else. "Because nobody has ever asked," he said. Ada Lohman looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a card out of her coat and wrote a number on the back of it, and said, "When you leave here, and you will call me before you call anyone else." Martin took the card. He did not know it yet, but she had just started a fire under his entire life, and had also, without meaning to, set a clock ticking for the man in the front of the shop. Because Roland Pike had understood something in that exchange that Martin had not. The cruelty came at a trade dinner, 6 weeks later, and it arrived in the form of Camille's sister. Bettina had always been the family's authority on what everyone was worth, and she had never made a secret of her assessment of Martin, and she cornered him by the drinks table with 2 other people in tow, having heard, apparently, some version of the separation. "Oh, Martin," she said brightly, loud enough to carry, "we were just talking about you." She smiled. The smile, "Camille told us everything, of course, the dramatic exit." She let it sit for effect. "You do know she is going to be fine, do you not? She has already been out twice, and you are sleeping in a workshop and gluing bits of wood together for a man who does not even put your name on the receipt. Honestly, at some point, a man has to look at his life and ask what he has actually built." The people around her laughed, and the old Martin would have absorbed it, made a small joke at his own expense, and moved politely away. But something had finished on a sidewalk 6 weeks earlier, and he did not lower his eyes. "You are right that my name is not on the receipt," Martin said quietly, and his voice carried further than hers had, because the room had gone still around it. "Which is interesting, because it is on the work." He picked up a napkin and set it down again, and looked at her. "Every instrument that has left that shop in 6 years has my hands in it, Bettina, and there are perhaps 4 people in this country who can recognize them, and one of them is standing about 10 feet behind you." The silence had teeth. And Ada Lohman, who had crossed the room without anyone noticing, said, in a voice like a door closing, "5, actually. There are 5, and I taught 2 of them." She turned her terrible attention on Bettina. "You have just told a room full of professionals that a man who can do a neck graft I would not attempt myself has built nothing." She let that hang. "I would think very carefully about which of you, the people in this room, are going to remember." Bettina went the color of ash and left the table. And Ada put her hand briefly on Martin's shoulder, which she had never done to anyone in living memory, and said, quietly, "Come and sit with me." But across the room Roland Pike watched the whole exchange with a glass in his hand and understood, with the cold precision of a man who has something to lose, that his backroom restorer had just been publicly identified by the one person alive whose word could unmake him. The man was Roland Pike, and he had built a business on something Martin Vogel had never once suspected. It was not simply that the work went out under his name. That was ordinary and shabby and legal. What Roland had actually been doing was worse and far more profitable. For 6 years he had been taking modest, unremarkable instruments, letting Martin restore them to a standard that made them look and sound like something considerably finer, and then selling them with attributions they did not deserve, quietly upgraded provenance. A hint here, a suggestive certificate there, at prices that were not remotely justified. Martin's work was so good that the restorations were invisible, which meant the instruments passed inspection, which meant Roland had been running a slow and beautiful fraud on the back of a craftsman who thought he was simply doing repairs. It had been perfect, because the only people who could ever detect it were the handful of appraisers in the world who could read a restorer's hand, and none of them had reason to look. Then Ada Lohman had walked into his shop with an instrument that had bothered her for 8 months, and had pulled his restorer out of the back room and into the light, and had told a dinner full of professionals that she knew those hands. Roland Pike smiled, thin and cold, and began very quietly to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Martin worked it out himself in the end, and he did it the way he did everything, slowly and with his hands. Ada had asked him a question at that dinner that would not leave him alone. She had asked what he had been given to work on over the years, and he had described it, and she had gone very quiet and then said, "That is a strange amount of quality passing through a shop like that." So, Martin went back through 6 years. He had kept, out of pure craftsman's habit, a work log of every instrument he had touched, with dates, condition notes, and small sketches of the work done, because his grandfather had taught him that a restorer who does not keep records is not a restorer but a vandal. Nobody had ever asked him for it. Nobody had known it existed. And when he laid it beside the shop's sales records, which he could see, because Roland had never once considered that the man in the back room might read them, the picture assembled itself with a horrible simplicity. Instruments he had logged as ordinary, honest, workmanlike pieces had been sold as something else entirely. Not once, 41 times across 6 years, he sat with it for 2 days. And then he called the number on the back of a card. Ada Lohman came to see him that evening, and she looked at his log for 90 minutes without speaking, and at the end of it, she took off her glasses and said, quietly, "Do you understand what you are holding?" Martin said he thought he did. "It is the only contemporaneous record of what those instruments actually were," she said. "He has the sales files, and he can rewrite those in an afternoon, but he cannot rewrite what the man who opened them wrote down at the time." She looked at him with something that, in another woman, would have been tenderness. "Martin, where is it kept?" "In the shop," he said. "In my bench drawer." Ada Lohman said a short word he had not expected from her. Then she said, "If you move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at you. He will come at that book." And neither of them knew that Roland Pike had already made that decision. The workshop went dark at 2:30. Martin was not in it, and that was the only reason the night ended the way it did. He had been sleeping in his rented room for a month by then, and he had woken, the way he had been waking for weeks at some small hour with his mind already working, and he had thought about a bench drawer, and he had got dressed and driven across a wet city on nothing but the feeling. He parked at the end of the road, and he saw, from 100 meters away, that the front of the shop was dark in the wrong way, because the security light over the door that had never once failed in 6 years was out, and a car he recognized was parked around the side with no lights. Martin Vogel sat in his car in the rain and did the arithmetic. He did not call the police first. That was the thing he could not entirely explain afterward, except that he had spent his whole life fixing things quietly, and he wanted once to see it with his own eyes. He went in through the yard door with his own key, silent as only a man who has worked in a building for 6 years can be, and he moved through the dark of a workshop he could have crossed blindfolded, past the racks, past the drawing cabinet, and he stood in the doorway of his own back room and watched Roland Pike going through his bench drawers with a torch in his teeth, Roland found the log. He held it up in the torchlight with an expression of profound relief and said out loud to an empty room, "There you are." And Martin Vogel said quietly from the doorway, "Put that down." The torch swung, and for a moment the two of them stood there, the man who had spent 6 years taking credit and the man who had spent 6 years not asking for it. And then Roland did what men like Roland always do, which was talk. He explained. He was almost warm about it. He said that Martin did not understand the business, that provenance was a matter of opinion, that everyone in the trade did some version of it, that Martin had been paid every month and had never once asked where the money came from, which made him a beneficiary and not a victim. He said that a man who spends his life in a back room does not get to develop a conscience about the front of the shop. And then he said the thing that finished him, which was, and let us be honest, Martin, nobody was ever going to know it was you. That is the whole point of you. And Martin Vogel, standing in the dark of the room where he had done the best work of his life for another man's profit, said, 41. Roland stopped. 41 instruments, Martin said. 6 years. I logged every one of them the day I opened it, with the date and the condition, and a sketch of the work, because my grandfather taught me to. He took one step into the room. That is not the book, Roland. That is the copy I made when Ada Lohman told me what you were doing. The original went into a bank box 8 days ago, and a second copy is with her, and she has already spoken to 2 of the buyers. He let it sit. You did not come here to take my work. You came here to be filmed taking it, and then the yard lights came up. Because Ada Lohman had not gone home when she left him, she had gone to the police, and the workshop filled with people. Time seemed to fracture, and in the middle of it, that severe, terrifying woman in her black coat came through the door and crossed straight to Martin, past the officers and the shouting, and took him by both arms. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, and her voice was not steady. "Did he touch you? Look at me. Breathe. Tell me." "I am fine," said Martin, and then, because he was still himself, he added, "He has my second best copy. I would like it back eventually." Ada Lohman closed her eyes and laughed, once in a way that startled everyone in that room, and then said into his shoulder, "You unbelievable man, 6 years in a back room, and you kept a book." Roland Pike, who had spent 6 years selling another man's hands as his own, learned the price of underestimating him over the following year. Martin did not testify with rage. He testified the way he worked, slowly and precisely and with sketches, and it was unanswerable, because there is no argument against a contemporaneous record kept by a craftsman with no motive to lie. He did not push for the maximum, and when Ada asked him why, he said mildly that he did not need to make a martyr of the man. He needed to make him nothing, and that the difference mattered. So they did it his way. Roland lost the shop, the license, and the trade, and every instrument he had ever sold was reopened, and the thing that actually finished him was not the charges, but the publication of the log, because 41 clients across 3 continents learned exactly what they had bought and exactly whose hands had made it worth anything. And Roland Pike's name became, permanently, a caution in a small and unforgiving profession. He was not destroyed. He was simply, comprehensively, known. As for Camille, the calls started in the 5th month. Martin had not told her anything. She learned it the way everyone did, because a trade publication ran a long piece about a restorer whose work had been sold under another man's name for 6 years, with a photograph of a man in an apron holding a scroll up to the light, and because Ada Lohman had said on the record that he was among the finest hands working in the country. Camille called. He was in the middle of gluing a top and did not pick up. She called again that evening, and the next day, and then it was 3 or 4 times a week. And the messages moved, over about a month, from cool to warm to something that sounded almost like the woman he had married 11 years earlier. He listened to every one of them exactly once. He did not delete them, and he did not return them. And Bettina, who had asked a room full of professionals what Martin had actually built, spent a long season being asked, at family gatherings and elsewhere, whether it was true that she had said that, and said, every time, that she had only been joking. A year later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Martin Vogel stood in a small workshop of his own, on a quiet street, with his grandfather's tools laid out on the bench in front of him, 3 of them still chipped, because he had never had them reground. There was a name on the window now. It was his. Ada Lohman came in without knocking, because she never knocked, and put a paper bag of pastries on the least valuable surface she could find. "You are standing there again," she said. "Looking at the tools." "I am thinking about the gouges," Martin said. "I could have had them repaired." "Do not you dare," said Ada. She poured herself coffee from his pot without asking. "Do you know what I understood that afternoon in his shop?" she said. "I had spent 40 years being lied to by men in the front of shops, and I put a violin on a counter and asked for the person who did the work, and out came a man with glue on his hands who had never once in 6 years asked for his name to be on anything." She looked at him over the cut. Every person in your life mistook that for having nothing to say. It never occurred to any of them that a man who does not need to be seen is the only kind who can afford to tell the truth. She raised the cup slightly. "She threw your tools off a balcony because she had decided they were a hobby. And those tools, and the book you kept because of them, took down a fraud that had run for 6 years, and the whole trade knows your name now, and she found out from a magazine." Martin Vogel looked at the row of chipped gouges on his own bench in his own shop, with his own name on the glass behind him, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not feel the need to be smaller than he was. He had spent 38 years being the one who cleaned up, absorbing contempt, until he had mistaken it for the ordinary weather of a life, and he had proven every last one of those quiet cruelties wrong without raising his voice once. Because the thing the world had dismissed as a hobby in a shed had turned out to be the only genuinely irreplaceable thing in the room. She had thrown his life off a balcony and stood there with her arms folded, waiting for him to come back upstairs. She watched him pick up every single thing off the sidewalk. That was the last time she ever saw him do it. If Martin's story of hidden worth, quiet dignity, and hard-won vindication moved you, if something in you steadied when he knelt on that sidewalk and then simply drove away, then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that walking away without an argument is not weakness, and that the thing people dismiss in you may be the only irreplaceable thing you have. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything they deserve. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Martin's story.